The criminal investigation into the insurrections, the largest federal probe ever, and it just got larger, as we've been reporting. It's moving beyond those who stormed the Capitol, who are the most obvious defendants, and reaching into the planning and the funding. The Department of Justice investigating Trump fans who organized the pivotal January 6th rally. Now, if that avenue of investigation does sound familiar, it's because while it's new for the federal prosecutors, the House January 6th committee has already begun gathering information from rally organizers. In fact, it was big news when House investigators began scrutinizing 11 people involved in the rally and their links to the White House.
We got a second round of subpoenas from the House committee investigating January 6th.
They were issued to 11 people tied to the events and rallies that took place before the insurrection.
The subpoenas seek planning and funding records, including any coordination with the Trump White House.
Coordination and planning is key. There's a difference between a rally that got out of hand and any efforts by the incumbent government to gather support for violence at the Capitol or an organized coup. Congress wants to get the facts from those planners on the ground, including someone who was on the campaign's payroll and then planned the rally, a name that comes up a lot in reporting about that day, Trump fundraiser Caroline Wren.
Today's characters, Phil Waldron, Alex Jones, Caroline Wren.
A woman named Caroline Wren.
Caroline Wren, a name that's probably familiar to your viewers.
Caroline Wren, a GOP fundraiser who, according to ProPublica, helped organize the rally.
Caroline Wren was and has been a top Republican fundraiser for some time.
Caroline Wren is a Republican Party veteran, a Trump loyalist who worked at high levels to help that January 6th rally happen. In fact, the government-required permit for that very day lists her as a, quote, VIP advisor for the rally. One Republican strategist told Business Insider that Wren emerged with more importance after Trump's election loss and was, quote, in the middle of everything in Trump land in that fateful period. Now, when the January 6th committee called, she answered, cooperating with its questions about people who collectively communicated with Trump about that day. And the committee knows she's worked for Trump advisor Kimberly Guilfoyle in the campaign. It was a money contact between the Trump campaign and the RNC. Indeed, there's some very controversial and famous right-wing figures who volunteer her as their key contact or plug going into the 6th, including Alex Jones.
I knew that Caroline Wren was a big fundraiser, headed up one of Trump's PACs. So, yes, that was my contact for the 5th and the 6th. Was Caroline Wren.
When it comes to doing this work, the January 6th committee knows what investigators always know. You have to go to the sources to get all of the information and evidence. I can tell you right now tonight, Caroline Wren joins me for her first MSNBC interview about all of this. She has rarely, if ever, discussed these issues or the probe on the news. Caroline Wren is my guest. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I appreciate it. So much interest in all of this. Let's start with that rally. What was, in your mind, the goal for the January 6th rally, and when do you think it went off track?
Sure. I think the rally afforded for hundreds of thousands of Americans to gather in their nation's capital to exercise their First Amendment right to protest. Obviously, there have been hundreds of rallies all across the country with President Trump. That was one of his sort of famous hallmarks and events, and I've been involved in a lot of them over the past few years. And so my role that day was similar to my role at other events, where it had been to assist many others in organizing and executing a professional and lawfully obtained, permitted event there at the White House ellipse.
And what about it going off track? When did you hear there could be violence, or when did you realize things were changing on the 6th?
Not until afterwards, when I saw on television what was happening when I was back at my hotel. And so I watched it sort of unfold with everyone else on television. I was not there at the Capitol that day.
And as mentioned, the committee subpoenaed you and you cooperated. Why did you choose to cooperate?
You didn't really have a choice not to. It was either to cooperate with them or to be held in contempt of Congress and face a $100,000 fine and potentially a year in jail, which you've seen happen to a few individuals. And I do think it is pretty alarming. I think the most dangerous, subpoenas that have been sent really have been to the event organizers. The 11 that you had mentioned earlier in the show, are individuals who are private citizens. We have not been accused of any wrongdoing. We're not involved in any violence at the Capitol, didn't partake in that, but we were involved in executing a lawfully permitted event at the White House Ellipse, which was 1.5 miles from the Capitol, and it was allowing for people to come to their nation's capital and to protest, even if you said what they believe to be a fraudulent election, and they have every right to do it. It's a primary pillar of American democracy to be able to protest your government.
Well,
and for private citizens, for Congress to be able to just come in and seize a year's worth of your text messages, your emails, your call logs, your geological information, absent any warrant or due process, I think is very concerning. I think it should be a concerning factor for any American citizen, regardless of your political affiliation.
Well, I take your point that you're a citizen, which is different than people who sign up for government service, et cetera. Right. Some of those individuals, as you well know, because you've worked with around or near some of them, Bannon, Navarro, they went a different way than you. Do you think that was a mistake? Do you think it'd be better if they just cooperated like you did?
Oh, I think there's been, over 100 people have now been subpoenaed, and everyone has to chart their own course and how they want to address it. So I think it's difficult for anyone who's having to face these sort of accusations by Congress that you have to decide how is it that you want to handle it. So I don't have anything, comments on their particular situations.
Okay. In your interview, which we're very interested with the committee, I'm curious, just briefly, yes or no, did they ask you about, for example, the rally leaders' contact with any militias?
No, that didn't really come up, and it's probably, you're forced to turn over all these different documents, and so there weren't communications, at least with any that I know of, like militia founders or things like that. So the questions are really more pertaining to the documents that you had turned over, and so at least for me, that it didn't go into that. What
would you say those documents and most of the questions focused on?
What was frustrating for me is they even will admit to you, we've reviewed hundreds of thousands of documents, and we've interviewed hundreds of people, and we have no reason to believe or see evidence you had anything to do with the attack on the Capitol. And so you should feel comfortable here today. And it's well, I'm very aware that I had nothing to do with it, but that doesn't change the fact that I'm, forced and being compelled to be here by Congress. And it does raise a lot of questions. I think what this committee does now sets a precedent for future congressional investigations. And I think there's a lot of people, when there is a Republican-led Congress, you have a little bit of open Pandora's box here. And I do hope that the committee takes that seriously and does look forward past 2022 and realize the implications that doing this could have in the future.
They're currently looking as well at Ginny Thomas because they obtained some of her text messages. You mentioned the research. Did you or your fellow organizers have contact with her?
No, it's funny. I have never had the opportunity to meet Jenny. I've never spoken with her, but I feel terrible for her. She's a private citizen. She has every right to her own beliefs, and I again have a very big problem with Congress taking private messages of individuals and then selectively leaking those to sort of embarrass and humiliate people on national television. And so Jenny Thomas, to me, she seems to be a wonderful, strong, passionate leader,
Now, one of your co-organizers quoted you as saying that Thomas was playing a sort of a peacemaking role among these different factions. Is that accurate that you said that, or where did you get that idea from?
I don't know. That was a quote from another individual, and I was a little confused by it, and I think in the article, actually, it says Ms. Wren disputes that. But I didn't really. I don't feel comfortable ever litigating out again people's personal messages that I don't really feel like that Congress has a right to in the first place, and then to go comment each time individually when press reaches out on those. But I did not ever hear or understand Ms. Thomas to have that role.
Okay. Well, that's good to know because that was out there. So this is you sort of giving that view, and people can factor that in. Yeah. You mentioned the text. There's government text, of course, that Congress has obtained. Katrina Pearson was someone who was the liaison to the White House, as you know. And she said in a text to Mr. Meadows, at the time chief of staff, very powerful guy, that she was concerned you were, quote, moving forward, I'm quoting, with, quote, the original psycho list of speakers that day, and that she, Ms. Pearson, would rather leave than be a part of you embarrassing the president. What was she talking about? Her view there is that somehow you were pushing a negative, embarrassing, and extreme agenda or set of speakers at the rally. Your response?
Right. I think it's similar to the Thomas text. I think it is these text messages that Congress has gone in and taken from hundreds of thousands of different ones over a year's time, and then they are selectively leaking just in little pockets of time different information out to embarrass folks. And so I think it is wrong. It is kind of grotesque almost to even have to listen to those happening and play out like that. I mean, at the end of the day, there were two separate events. There was an event at the White House Ellipse, and then 1.5 miles away, some bad actors took place and violence at the Capitol. But the erased distinction between those who were involved in organizing or attending a First Amendment protest at the White House Ellipse from those who were involved in violence at the Capitol has become a hallmark of Speaker Pelosi's efforts to embed the events of January 6th into the American psyche and to indict and humiliate those of us who are in political dissent.
Well,
there is going to be an endless number, I would imagine, of isolated text messages that they just leak out to fit a certain narrative. But I would, caution Americans from going into that game.
Caroline, you're raising something really important that has become a real fault line in the discussion of this, and that's why I appreciate you coming on, because let's discuss it. When someone says there's a free speech right for people to peacefully gather and speak and share their views about the election, including their criticism of the election, that's absolutely free speech, and that absolutely is a part of the American tradition. When then a bunch of people from that same place and gathering go and do violence and do an insurrection, that's bad. And so with Trump summoning them on the 6th, those people came. Many of them, as you know, went to the speech part, and then that was a warm-up, a proverbial insurrection pre-party for going to go do violence at the Capitol and do the insurrection. So I take your point that the speech part is protected and there are people who didn't go. But a lot of people did, which is why this is such a big deal. So when people hear you say and other organizers say as if they're completely divorced, I mean, how many people were at the rally and how many people violently trespassed and breached the Capitol? Do you know the numbers?
Yeah, the overwhelming majority of those in Washington, D.C. on January 6th did not participate in violence at the Capitol. It is very much overwhelming. It was hundreds. I've seen reports of hundreds of thousands of people who were there that day, and there has to be personal accountability here. I think if someone did partake in violence at the Capitol, then they are personally responsible for that. In the same way that if someone storms a stage at the Oscars and protests violence, they are personally responsible for that.
Will Smith definitely wrong to do violence. When you say what you think the rally was, which you helped plan, the numbers matter. So you just gave me hundreds of thousands. Do you know how many people breached the Capitol, roughly estimated?
I do not.
So it was about, according to multiple independent estimates, and they've got a lot of data on this, they've got a lot of documentation, as you know, it's about 10,000 people who were at the January 6th rally, and it's 2,000 who breached the Capitol. So that means that 1 out of 5 people, roughly, who were at your rally went from there to go do crime. Yes.
Those numbers are very off-base. There was not. There was way more. If you look at those pictures of people who had come to D.C. who were at the White House.
Those are the rough estimates. So the 2,000 is a lot of people. You would understand why that's more than a handful of bad apples, right? That was a very large number of people because they were able to breach the Capitol Police who are armed. They were able to do violence. Right. You saw them overwhelm it. What do you say to people who look at this rally and say, yes, you have the right to speak and gather, but you helped plan an event that furnished a road for 2,000 people to go do this violence. Isn't that wrong? Don't you condemn that?
Oh, sure. I condemn any forms of violence and any act of violence, but I will not apologize for assisting others in gathering in their nation's capital to air their grievances of government in a peaceful way, which is what happened at the White House Ellipse. There was no disturbances at the Ellipse. The event was lawfully permitted and a peaceful protest, and I believe that is a primary pillar of American democracy.
But the 2,000 people, you see, they heard the speeches there, they heard from the president, and then they went and attacked the Capitol. He told them, go to the Capitol. So don't you think that if you could do it over, here's another way to say it, because I recognize your free speech rights, and I think this is an important conversation for people to hear. If you could do it over, would you want the president at the time not to tell people to go march on the Capitol?
I think it's very hard to look back and relive. I've no involvement in the speech writing or anything like that. That was not a role that I play. Like, my role as a VIP advisor was to assist in the seating and credentialing process, which is, again, a role I've done at hundreds of rallies at many different political candidates and events. And so going back in time, that would never have been my role to play
right,
there.
I'm not asking you if it's your role at the time.
Certainly, I think that people,
you think what?
I was just going to say, yeah, certainly, like, the events that happened later that day were very difficult to watch and a bad day for democracy. But I do think it was an isolated number of people. There was a lot of people there who had every right to be in D.C.
You made that point, and that's on the record. But Donald Trump should not have told all those people gathered at your rally to go march on the Capitol.
No, he has the right to say anything that he wants to say, and I do not believe that one led to the other.
You don't believe him sending those people fired up from there to the Capitol. You think that had nothing to do with it? You understand that strains credibility. I mean, again, I respect you coming on the program.
Yep.
I respect that you cooperated with the committee. People are listening to you, and it sounds logical up to a point. The free speech part, the gathering. But when roughly 1 out of 5 people go do that, and we know what they did, they were chanting "Hang Mike Pence." They were trying to kill members of Congress, and Donald Trump sent them to march there.
You're pulling out select phrases to help fit a narrative. Like, everyone there was not chanting,
I'll let you respond,
Pence.
but I'll finish and I'll let you respond. It's not a narrative. It's what they said and did. They attacked the police officers. We've seen the video, and it was a real significant portion of the people, and they went because of the president's words. And so it's confusing, unless there's a political reason, it's confusing to not be able to say, given what you know now, if you are against the violence, you're telling us you're against the violence, we want to take you at your word, then wouldn't you be against the sending of the people who did the violence?
Yes, I've said multiple times since I've been on here that I condemn any violence that would have happened, but it was not my experience in what I saw that day. At the completely peaceful and lawfully permitted event at the White House Ellipse, I saw way more than 10,000 people, first of all. And then in my immediate line of sight, the people I dealt with, there were, nuns, students, Christian, like, totally peaceful. And a lot of the people came and then went home. And also, I think it is also a little bit dishonest to not actually look at the timeline of events that happened. As I mentioned earlier, the White House Ellipse is 1.5 miles away from the U.S. Capitol. And when the president, even you said earlier, was speaking, it's now very much known and documented that there was already disturbances happening 1.5 miles away at the Capitol. And then for those individuals to even make it all the way down there in time, the timing doesn't even work out. And so, and saying 1 in 5 individuals is also, I think, intellectually dishonest. It was not 1 in 5 individuals. I think that there's many, many press reports that will show way more than 10,000 people were in Washington, D.C. that day and spread out. And so I don't think those numbers are correct.
Yep. Well, Caroline, as mentioned, you cooperated with the committee. You agreed to come on and take the questions. We appreciate that. People can have their own reactions and evaluations, but I appreciate you taking the questions.
Yeah. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. Thank you, Caroline Wren.